Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello and welcome to Now Where Were We, an ongoing series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. I'm Deborah Ross. And this is the next in our series that I've been calling By the Decades. Each episode we feature a different decade in our area's history, and we are up to the 1890s. And I'm here at the corner of Clearbrook and Lacey Boulevard in Lacey, Washington, with my dear friend Lanny Weaver. Lanny is the president of the Lacey Historical Society, and she is my go-to person for Lacey history, and it's just great to have you here today. So we are talking about the 1890s, but I'd like you to set the stage and talk about what this intersection would have looked like in 1889.
It was a wilderness. We're right in the middle of the Isaac Wood donation land claim, which was 320 acres. Now, some of the land had transferred over the years up to 1889, but basically all there were a few very scattered houses. Over by where the old Albertsons is was a school, and to our right was possibly the George Warren Carpenter store. That's it. Oh, except for the fact that right in front of us was the major highway between Olympia and Tacoma. It was called the Olympia-Steilacoom Road.
So what was this community called in 1889, Lanny?
It was called Woodland because of Isaac Wood. The school district was the Wood School District.
So we might have thought that Woodland was named after the woods that were here, but in fact it was named after somebody named Woods.
Correct.
Okay, well, let's skip ahead then a couple of years. We're now in the 1890s. In 1891, a whole lot of things happened in our community.
It was a huge year in the history of this community. And it actually started back in 1889, our first year that we were talking about. And that's because Isaac Ellis, a former mayor of Olympia, and a man better known for being involved in the timber industry, decided that what the Olympia area really needed was a racetrack. Horse racing was huge in the 19th century. And so he came to a spot where he knew he could find land available, which happened to be right here, and was on a major road, the Olympia-Steilacoom Road. At the same time, the Tacoma, Olympia, and Grace Harbor Railroad, a subsidiary of the Northern Pacific Railroad, had decided this would be a good community to go through where it could lay its track to connect Tacoma and Olympia. And basically what they did was to follow the road that was already here. It was sort of parallel to it.
So we have the racetrack being developed and we have the railroad being developed. Are there any remnants of the railroad, Lanny, left?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, just in front of us is the Rails to Trails walking path, and that was the route that the railroad took. In addition, there was a depot there, and Ellis may have had a hand in convincing the railroad to put it here because of his racetrack. And it stood where the Clearbrook, we can see the Clearbrook sign from here, and where it crosses now Pacific Avenue.
Now, what about the racetrack? Where was that located?
The racetrack was back where we're looking, sort of facing the Clearbrook subdivision. That's where the racetrack was. It was a mile in circumference. It was huge. It was big. It dominated the landscape. But it wasn't the only thing that Ellis built. He also put up grandstands, so of course people could watch the races. He had barns for the horses, and he had fencing all over. So this was really an occupied site. In addition, he built a clubhouse a big clubhouse, but eventually it became a hotel, and it stood approximately where the Cheers restaurant is right now.
Very close to where we're standing right now.
Exactly.
So I can sort of picture people taking the train out and going.
Absolutely. And you know what it did for this community? Because, as I said, it was a wilderness before, but all of a sudden it had a lot of attention paid to it. So it wasn't just the racetrack, but this was a beautiful location because he, in addition, had built a park-like setting that would attract people. In fact, he called it the Woodland Driving Park, and people would come for picnics or just to get out of Olympia and spend the day. They could come by railroad, although that would have been extreme, or they could have come by wagon, and there was actually even a bike path from Olympia to this area.
And really, 1890 was kind of the beginning of the big bicycle craze in our area.
Absolutely, yeah. You'd see all of those functions right here in this community right here.
Lanny, the sign behind us, the Lacey Downs sign, is kind of a memory of the fact that there was a racetrack very close to here at one time.
There was a racetrack close to here, although it was not ever called Lacey Downs. There were other names for it, but it was not called Lacey Downs.
Okay. So what happened to the racetrack then?
The racetrack, unbelievably, was not successful. It opened with such fanfare and there were such high hopes for it, but it never really made money for anybody who ever owned it. And there were a lot of people who actually owned the racetrack. It changed hands several times, and eventually it ended up as being a place where people could board their horses and train their horses. And unfortunately, in 1976, it was torn down to make way for the Clearbrook subdivision.
So any remnants of that left at all, Lanny?
Not that I know of. I really don't know of any physical remnants of the racetrack. But what it did do was that it brought attention to this community, a focus right here, and it helped to build the depot, which was big for the community as well. And it's one of the factors that was at play when the Benedictine brothers were looking for a place to build St. Martin's College, and as we know, they did. So even though there are no physical remnants, actually, it should be in our memories, and the Lacey Downs sign helps because of what it did and what it contributed to this community.
Now, the other thing that happened in 1891 with that growth was there was a need for a post office because people were starting to move in here. Is that right?
Well, I think it had to do with the community all of a sudden feeling important. Other small communities had post offices. Why couldn't they have a post office? So in the spring of 1891, they sent a letter, a petition, an application to the post office department in Washington, D.C., and of course they asked for the name on the post office to be Woodland. But as you know, the name Woodland was rejected. And the reason it was rejected was because there already was a post office in Washington with the name Woodland. And so what they said was, pick another name. And as we know, they chose the name Lacey. Lacey actually was a man named O.C. Lacey. It is just basically suggested that he was the source. There is no actual proof that he was the source, but that is the story that has come down through the decades, that it was O.C. Lacey was the source. He had nothing to do with this community, which is really, really interesting. He was this sort of disreputable character from Olympia. And so a lot of myths and stories have come up to explain why the name Lacey was on the post office. And as you know, both you and I have studied this issue, and we don't have an answer. And there are a lot of people who have, in fact, looked at it, and nobody can say why the name was Lacey. But if you were there in 1891 when that name was suggested, you would have thought, it was just a post office. It doesn't mean anything. Our community is Woodland.
Right. So, so it was just the post office, and people still continued for some time to think of themselves as living in the community of Woodland.
Absolutely, but I think what happened was, and for the same reason that there already was a Woodland in Washington, that it became preferable to actually start calling this community Lacey. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. It took time, and it wasn't officially gone until 1924. Lacey was then accepted as the name of the voting precinct, which had been Woodland up until that time.
Well, this is a fascinating story, Lanny, and a great place to be filming because this is kind of where it all began.
Exactly.
And for our friends and fans of this show who want to know more about the history of Lacey, Lanny has written a series of articles on Thurston Talk about the early history of Lacey, Washington, up until its incorporation finally in 1966.
Correct.
So thank you so much for being here, Lanny, and we'll see you again as we go along through the decades.
Thank you, Deb.